friends. I'm really glad you're here. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've been walking with me for a while now, I'm grateful that you keep coming back. This space has always been about practicing faith, healing, and growing out loud. In real life, not in theory. Today's episode grew out of something I've been sitting with and processing, and it felt important to share it with you. Not as someone who has it all figured out, but as a friend who's still learning and moving forward. One of the things I've learned about how God works in my life is that some of the most important shifts don't come in dramatic moments. They come quietly, through people, through conversations, through sermons that don't just stay in the room where you heard them. This episode was sparked by a sermon our teaching pastor Quincy shared recently. One of those messages that settled in slowly and stayed with me. Not because it said something brand new, but because it put a language around something I've lived with for a long time and maybe hadn't fully named yet. And that matters to me because this podcast isn't created in isolation. It's shaped by the people God places in my everyday life. The ones who speak truth in ways that don't feel loud or forceful, but steady. The kind of words that follow you home and start rearranging things internally. Quincy talked about pressing forward, not about being defined by what's behind you, but also not pretending that it didn't exist. About moving ahead with intention, even when the road isn't clean or clear. And that tension, that holding the past honestly while still moving forward, is where I want to sit with you today. For a long time, I told myself I would start when things slowed down, when life felt calmer, when my schedule opened up, when I had more margin, when the timing felt better. I didn't always say it out loud, but it was there. This quiet belief that there would eventually be a season where everything felt a little less heavy, a little less full, and then I would finally begin. But the truth is, that season never really came. Life didn't slow down, it just changed shape. One thing ended and something else filled its place. One responsibility eased and another showed up. One season closed and the next one arrived without waiting for me to even catch my breath. And somewhere along the way, I had to admit something uncomfortable. I wasn't actually waiting for life to slow down. I was waiting for it to feel safer. Safer from failing, safer from getting my hopes up again, safer from starting something I wasn't sure I could sustain. Waiting felt responsible. It sounded wise and it looked patient, but underneath it, waiting was costing me more than I wanted to admit. Because every time I postponed starting, I was reinforcing the idea that I needed perfect conditions in order to move forward, and perfect conditions don't exist in real life. There's always an uncertainty, and always a disruption. There's always something unfinished. And if you require everything to be calm before you begin, you may never begin at all. I think sometimes we confuse wisdom with hesitation. We tell ourselves we're being thoughtful when really we're just being afraid. Afraid of starting and discovering we don't have what it takes. Afraid of beginning again after having tried before. Afraid of putting effort into something that might not work out the way that we hope. So we wait. We wait for clarity. We wait for confidence. We wait for motivation. But clarity doesn't usually come after movement, or usually comes after movement, not before it. Confidence is built by doing, not by planning. And motivation is often the result of progress, not the prerequisite. There is no perfect time to start something meaningful. There never has been. Think about it. There's no perfect time to have a baby. No season where everything is settled, predictable, and easy. People don't step into parenthood because life is calm. They step into it because the why is strong enough to carry them through the chaos. The same is true for healing, for growth, for obedience, and for change. If your why isn't strong enough to walk you through the disruption, it probably won't last very long. But when your why is rooted, really rooted, it doesn't disappear just because things get hard. That was something I had to learn slowly. I kept waiting for a pause that never came, waiting for a season where I wouldn't have to juggle so much at once, waiting for a moment when I could give something my full undivided attention. But real life doesn't offer clean starts or uninterrupted focus. It offers imperfect beginnings, messy middles, and progress that happens alongside everything else. At some point, I had to decide that waiting wasn't neutral. It was shaping me, teaching me to be cautious instead of courageous, teaching me to postpone instead of participate. And the realization was sobering because the longer I waited, the more intimidating starting became. What once felt possible started to feel overwhelming. What once felt exciting started to feel heavy. And the gap between where I was and where I wanted to be felt wider with every delay. Waiting didn't make it easier, it made it harder. And that's when I started understanding something important. There is a difference between being patient and being paralyzed. Patience is active. It trusts God while still taking steps forward. Paralysis stays put, telling itself it's waiting on the right moment. And if I'm honest, I spent too much time stuck between the two. I didn't need life to slow down. I needed to stop letting the fullness of life keep me frozen. I needed permission to start before I felt ready, before things were clear, before I had it all figured out. Because growth doesn't require perfect timing, it requires a willingness. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is begin, not because everything is aligned, but because you're tired of standing still. For years, I lived on what could only be described as a hamster wheel. I would decide to start something, a goal, a habit, a change I genuinely wanted, and I would start with so much hope and intention. I really believed that this time would be different. I wasn't half-hearted about it. I cared. I wanted it, and I meant it. But then life would happen. I would miss a day, lose focus, get tired, or feel overwhelmed, and suddenly the entire thing felt ruined. In my mind, a stumble wasn't just a stumble, it was a proof that I had failed completely. So I would quit. And then, after a little time passed, after the disappointment had softened just enough, I would start again with the same excitement, the same promises to myself, and the same amount of determination, only to end up right back in the same place. I would start, stumble, quit, and repeat the cycle again, over and over and over. What I didn't understand then was that I wasn't failing because I lacked discipline or desire. I was failing because I didn't know how to stay in the process when things weren't perfect. I didn't have a category for imperfect progress. Everything felt all or nothing. Either I was doing it right or I wasn't doing it at all. And there was no middle ground, no grace for missteps, no permission to pause, adjust, or keep moving. And that way of thinking is exhausting. Over time, it wears you down. It erodes your confidence and teaches you to distrust yourself in ways you didn't even realize were happening. Every time you quit, it reinforces the belief that you can't be trusted to follow through. Eventually, you start believing that about yourself before you even begin. That's the part that no one really talks about. That damage isn't just in stopping, it's in what stopping teaches you about who you are. For a long time, I truly believed that if I couldn't do something consistently, then I shouldn't do it at all. That if I couldn't get it done right the first time, then it probably wasn't meant for me. But that wasn't wisdom. That's discouragement dressed up as realism. The turning point came when I realized I was tired of carrying that same cycle. Tired of restarting, tired of feeling like I had failed before I ever really gave myself a chance, tired of making promises to myself that I didn't yet know how to keep. I wasn't tired of trying, I was tired of quitting. That's when I made a small and very intentional decision. I started my health journey on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday is special, not because it held any symbolic meaning, but because I didn't want the Monday reset in my head anymore. I didn't want to give myself the mental escape hatch of failing midweek and telling myself I would just start over again on Monday. I had lived that rhythm for too long. Monday would come with hope and motivation, and by Wednesday I would feel behind, and by Friday I was already planning my fresh start for the following week. Starting on a Tuesday took that option away. It forced me to confront something deeper. I didn't need a better plan. I didn't need a cleaner start. I didn't need more motivation. I needed a stronger why. A why that could carry me through the rough patches instead of disappearing the moment things got hard. A why that didn't rely on perfect streaks or uninterrupted progress. A why that reminded me that progress wasn't about perfection, it was about a direction. That's when I began to understand something that changed everything for me. Progress isn't linear, and it never has been. We like to imagine growth as a straight line, steady improvement, forward momentum, and visible results. But real progress looks nothing like that. Real progress looks like trying, stumbling, adjusting, and continuing. It looks like learning as you go instead of expecting yourself to already know how. It looks like falling down, getting back up, dusting yourself off, and moving forward anyway. Most progress is made through a lot of stumbles in the right direction. And the only true failure isn't stumbling, it's quitting entirely. Once I stopped defining failure as falling short and started defining failure as giving up, I finally had room to grow. I could stumble and stay in motion. I could have a hard day without erasing all the good days that came before it. I didn't have to start over every time I struggled. I could just keep going. That didn't suddenly make things easy, but it did make them sustainable. And sustainability matters far more than intensity ever will. Intensity burns out. Sustainability carries you forward. And this applies to so much more than health. It applies to faith, to healing, to habits, to relationships, to any area where you've tried before and felt like you didn't measure up. If you've ever told yourself, "What's the point? I've already messed it up," you're not alone. But that thought isn't telling you the truth. Messing up doesn't disqualify you. It invites you to keep going differently. Learning how to stay, especially when things aren't perfect, is a skill. And like any skill, it's learned through practice, not perfection. I didn't stop failing because I got better. I got better because I stopped quitting. And that distinction matters more than we realize. There's another layer to the story that took me longer to recognize, mostly because it looked responsible on the surface. I love a good plan. I love structure, systems, and things that feel orderly and intentional. And if I'm being honest, I really love a good color-coded system. Tabs, highlighters, sections, categories, that part of my brain lights up when things feel organized and thought through. Creating a system feels like movement. It feels productive. It gives the impression that I'm heading in the right direction. But what I eventually had to admit to myself was that for a long time, planning had become the substitute for actually starting. I could spend hours designing the perfect system, mapping everything out, refining categories, adjusting details, and never take a single step towards the goal the system was meant to support. On the outside, it looked like progress, but on the inside, it was another way to avoid the risk of failure. Planning feels safe. When you're planning, you haven't stumbled yet. You haven't disappointed yourself. You haven't had to find out whether you can actually sustain what you've designed. Planning allows you to stay in control, and control can feel comforting, especially if you lived through seasons where life felt unpredictable or painful. But control can also keep you quietly stuck. I didn't realize how often I was redesigning instead of doing. Every time I came across a new idea, a new tool, or a new method, it felt like justification to start over again. I would tell myself I was simply refining the system, making it better, and preparing more thoroughly, and in reality, I was postponing action. There was always something else to add, something else to improve, something else to optimize. Perfection stayed just out of reach, and as long as it did, I didn't have to begin. Part of that came from a deeper fear I didn't want to name. If I never fully started, I never fully failed. I could stay safely in the space of intention without stepping into vulnerability of action. I could say I was working on it without having to confront whether I could actually follow through. That pattern showed up in small, almost embarrassing ways. I would make a to-do list and hesitate to write on it because I wanted it to look neat and tidy. If I made a mistake or changed my mind, I would rewrite the entire list instead of simply crossing something out and continuing. Scratched out items felt messy, and messiness felt like failure. Eventually, I realized I had to stop making to-do lists altogether, not because they weren't helpful, but because I didn't want to mess them up. Somewhere along the way, I had started valuing the appearance of order more than actual progress. That realization forced me to ask a hard question. Was I more committed to doing this well or to it looking like I was doing it well? Because those two things are not always the same. Real growth is rarely tidy. Real change often looks messy. Progress leaves evidence behind, crossed out plans, revised expectations, and adjustments made along the way. If you require everything to stay clean and perfect, you may never allow yourself to fully participate in the process. I also had to confront how closely planning was tied to my desire for control. When life feels overwhelming, control can disguise itself as wisdom. It tells you that if you can just organize things well enough, everything will finally feel calm. If you can anticipate every variable, nothing will catch you off guard. But life doesn't work that way. You can plan thoughtfully and still be interrupted. You can build a system and still have days where things don't go as expected. No amount of preparation removes the reality that real life is unpredictable. That doesn't mean planning is wrong. It means planning can't replace trust. At some point, I had to loosen my grip and remind myself that systems were meant to support growth, not to control it. That plans are tools, not guarantees. The goal isn't to execute something perfectly, but to keep showing up, even when things feel messy. The moment I stopped trying to create the perfect system was the moment I finally started moving. Not faster, not dramatically, just steadily. I learned to let the plan grow with me instead of demanding that I live up to it flawlessly. I allowed room for adjustment without interpreting every deviation as failure, and that shift mattered. Control might feel safe, but it doesn't lead to transformation. Trust does. Trust that you can begin without having everything figured out. Trust that you can adjust without starting over. Trust that growth doesn't require perfection, it requires presence. Letting go of control didn't mean letting go of intention, it meant choosing progress over polish. And once I stopped trying to protect myself from failure at all costs, I finally gave myself permission to move forward in a way that was real. Another place I got stuck for a long time was information overload. There's no shortage of voices telling you how to get from where you are to where you want to be. No matter what your goal is, whether it's health, faith, healing, productivity, relationships, there are going to be books, podcasts, programs, articles, and experts promising that they've figured it out. They tell you exactly what to do, exactly what not to do, and exactly how long it should take, and exactly what worked for them. And for a while, I believed that if I could just gather enough information, I would finally feel confident enough to start. So I read the books, I listened to the podcasts, I bookmarked the articles, saved the posts, took notes, and compared the approaches. I tried to figure out which method was best and the smartest and the most effective. I told myself I was being thorough, responsible, and wise. But what I didn't realize at the time was that every new resource didn't bring clarity, it brought more pressure. Each voice added another layer of expectation, another set of rules, another way I might get it wrong. And instead of narrowing the path forward, the options multiplied until the whole thing felt overwhelming. What started as curiosity turned into paralysis. Because when everyone claims to know the exact path from point A to point B, it can start to feel like there's only one right way to do things. And if you don't follow it perfectly, then maybe you're setting yourself up to fail. But the problem is, most of those plans don't account for real life. They don't account for exhaustion, interruptions, stress, illness, grief, changing seasons, or limited capacity. They don't account for the fact that what worked for one person in one season of their life may not work for you and yours. Most resources are sharing what worked for them, not what will necessarily work for you. And somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't actually learning how to move forward. I was trying to overhaul everything all at once. Every plan felt like a complete transformation, a total reset, a full system change. I wasn't choosing one thing to work on, I was trying to fix everything simultaneously. And that's not sustainable. Trying to change everything at once creates pressure instead of progress. It turns growth into a burden instead of a practice. It makes every decision feel heavy and every misstep feel like a confirmation that you're not cut out for this. I didn't need more information. I needed less noise. I needed permission to stop chasing the perfect plan and to start paying attention to what I could realistically sustain. And that's when I began to understand the power of one small step. Not a massive overhaul, not a complete system change, not a long list of expectations, one small, manageable step. Something simple enough that I could do it even on my worst day, even when I was tired, even when life felt heavy, and even when motivation was low. Because if a habit or practice only works on your best days, it probably won't last very long. But if it works on your hardest days, it has the potential to change everything. I had to let go of the idea that bigger was better, that more effort meant more faithfulness, and that doing everything at once was proof of commitment. Instead, I learned to ask a different question. What is one small thing I can do today that moves me in the right direction? Not the most impressive thing, not the fastest thing, not the thing that looks best on paper, the next faithful thing. That shift required humility. It required letting go of comparison, and it required trusting that slow progress was still progress, and that consistency mattered more than intensity. It also required discernment. Not every voice deserves equal weight. Not every strategy needs to be tried, and not every opinion needs to be followed. Learning to quiet the noise and listen for what fits in your life, your capacity, and your season is a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice. I started to notice which voices created peace and which ones created pressure, which ones invited growth and which ones stirred anxiety, which ones encouraged faithfulness and which ones demanded perfection. And I gave myself permission to walk away from what felt heavy, even if it worked for someone else. That wasn't giving up, it was choosing wisely. I didn't need to know the entire path forward. I just needed to take the next step that was in front of me. And when I focused on that, one small step at a time, something surprising happened. The process became lighter, the resistance softened, and the fear lost some of its power. Progress stopped feeling like something I had to force and started feeling like something I could live with. One step led to another. One habit created space for the next, and slowly, steadily, a rhythm began to form. Not because I followed the perfect plan, but because I finally chose the one that fit. At some point, all of these threads began to converge for me. The waiting for life to slow down, the cycle of starting and stopping, the need for control disguised as planning, the overwhelm of too many voices and too much information. What I began to see was that none of these things existed in isolation. They were all connected to the same underlying struggle, the tension between wanting certainty and being invited to trust. I wanted guarantees before I moved. I wanted reassurance that I wouldn't fail again. I wanted to know that the effort would be worth it before I invested myself fully. But growth rarely offers you that kind of clarity up front. There's always an element of risk involved in moving forward. There's always a degree of uncertainty, and if we require certainty before we begin, we often end up standing still far longer than we intended. That's why the idea of pressing forward has stayed with me. Not pressing forward because everything is resolved, not pressing forward because the path is obvious, but pressing forward in spite of it all. There's a passage in Philippians where Paul talks about this posture, not as someone who has arrived, but as someone who is still moving. He acknowledges the past without being ruled by it, and he commits himself to what lies ahead, even though the road is still unfolding. What strikes me about that passage isn't its urgency or intensity, it's the honesty. Paul doesn't pretend that growth is easy. He doesn't claim mastery. He simply names his direction and keeps going. And that feels deeply relatable. So often we think moving forward requires confidence, strength, or certainty, but what it actually requires is a willingness to keep showing up, a willingness to stay in the process, a willingness to trust that progress can happen even when the outcome isn't fully clear. Pressing forward doesn't mean ignoring what's behind you. It means It means refusing to let it define the next step. The past can inform you, it can teach you, it can shape your wisdom, but it doesn't get to decide whether you move. I had to learn how to carry my past honestly without carrying it as a weight, to acknowledge what didn't work without letting it convince me that nothing ever would. That's a subtle shift, but it's a powerful one. Because once I stopped using my past as evidence against myself, I was able to approach the present with more openness. I could try again without the same level of fear, and I could move forward without demanding perfection from myself. I also began to see that pressing forward is not a one-time decision. It's a posture you return to again and again. Some days it feels strong and steady. Other days it feels quiet and almost reluctant. But the posture remains the same, choosing movement over stagnation, trust over control, and faithfulness over fear. Pressing forward doesn't require grand gestures. It often looks ordinary. It shows up in the small decisions, the consistent choices, and the willingness to keep going even when motivation fades. It looks like continuing after a hard day instead of quitting. It looks like adjusting instead of abandoning. And it looks like trusting that slow growth is still growth. And that posture changes the way you experience the journey. Instead of measuring yourself by how far you've come or how much you've accomplished, you begin to measure yourself by whether you're still moving, whether you're still engaged, and whether you're still willing. That shift creates space for grace. Grace when you stumble, grace when you have to recalibrate, and grace when the path looks different than you expected. Pressing forward anyway doesn't mean pushing through at all costs. It means staying connected to the direction that you've chosen, even when the pace changes. And you begin to live that way, and something else starts to happen. The journey becomes less about proving something and more about becoming someone. Less about achieving an outcome and more about forming a way of living. You stop asking, am I doing this perfectly? And start asking, am I still showing up? And most of the time, that question is enough to keep you moving. As I sit with all of this, what I keep coming back to is how gentle the invitation really is. Pressing forward anyway doesn't demand that you have everything figured out. It doesn't require a flawless plan, a perfect system, or an uninterrupted stretch of motivation. It simply asks whether you're willing to keep moving, even slowly, in the direction you know matters. That's what I love about the way Paul talks about this in Philippians. He doesn't present himself as someone who has arrived or achieved some ideal version of faithfulness. He names the reality honestly. He hasn't reached the goal yet. He hasn't mastered the journey, and yet he still presses on. Not because the past no longer exists, but because it no longer controls him. That distinction has mattered more to me than I can easily explain. For a long time, I've let my past function as evidence against myself. Every failed attempt, every abandoned plan, every unfinished goal quietly reinforced the belief that maybe I just wasn't the kind of person who followed through with things. Maybe I wasn't disciplined enough. Maybe I wasn't consistent enough. Maybe I just needed to accept that this was as far as I could ever go. But pressing forward anyway requires a different kind of honesty. It asks you to acknowledge what's behind you without letting it dictate what's ahead of you. It invites you to learn from the past without staying trapped in it. It allows the story to continue without rewriting everything that came before. And that's a gift. Because when you stop using your past as a verdict, you create space for growth to happen in the present. You give yourself permission to try again without carrying the same weight of shame. You begin to approach change not as a test that you must pass, but as a journey you're allowed to stay in. I think that's where real transformation takes root. Not in dramatic overhauls or perfectly executed plans, but in small, faithful decisions made over time. Decisions to keep showing up, decisions to adjust instead of abandon, decisions to trust that movement, even imperfect movement, is still movement. If you're listening to this and feeling the tension between where you've been and where you want to go, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need a perfect time to begin. You don't need a flawless plan. You don't need to erase your past in order to move forward. You just need a reason, a strong enough reason to take the next step. Whatever that step looks like today. That step doesn't have to be impressive. It can be small, it can be quiet, and it can be something that only you know about. What matters is that it's honest and sustainable, something you can carry with you into real life, not just into ideal circumstances. The journey doesn't need to end because you stumble. It only ends if you decide to stop walking it altogether. And even then, grace has a way of meeting you right where you are. So if today feels like a restart, let it be a gentle one. If it feels like a continuation, let that be enough. And if it feels like you're still figuring things out, know that you're not behind. You're in process. And pressing forward anyway with humility, intention, and trust is more than enough to keep you moving. Here's where this gets honest. Pressing forward anyway sounds grounded and hopeful when we talk about it in theory, but living it out day after day is a very different thing, because eventually the initial clarity fades and the excitement wears off and life interrupts. And then you're left with ordinary days that don't feel particularly meaningful or motivating. This is usually where the old patterns try to resurface. The urge to wait until you're more inspired, the temptation to pause until things calm down, the quiet thought that maybe you should stop for now and come back to it later. Those moments don't mean anything has gone wrong. They mean you're human. One of the biggest shifts for me was realizing that motivation is a terrible measure of whether something is worth continuing. Motivation comes and goes. It responds to emotion, energy, and circumstances. And if you rely on it, you'll always be vulnerable to quitting the moment things feel harder than expected. What actually sustains forward movement is commitment, not the rigid, punishing kind, but the steady decision to keep showing up even when the feelings change. Pressing forward in real life looks far less dramatic than we imagine. It looks like choosing consistency over intensity. It looks like continuing with what you said mattered, even when no one else is watching and nothing feels especially rewarding. It also looks like learning how to respond when you stumble, because stumbling doesn't stop once you decide to keep going. It just stops being the end of the story. There are still days where you fall back into old habits, miss a step, or lose focus. The difference is what you do next. Instead of spiraling into shame or declaring the whole thing ruined, you pause, recalibrate, and continue. And that response takes practice. It requires resisting the urge to dramatize setbacks. It means refusing to let one off day become the verdict about who you are or whether this is working. It means choosing to see that setbacks as information rather than condemnation. That alone can change everything. Another piece of pressing forward in real life is learning how to work with your capacity instead of constantly fighting against it. There are seasons where you have more energy, more margin, more emotional bandwidth, and there are seasons where simply showing up at all is an accomplishment. Pressing forward doesn't ask you to perform at the same level in every season. It asks you to stay honest about where you are and adjust without quitting. That kind of flexibility isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I had to let go of the idea that consistency meant doing the same thing at the same level all the time. What it actually means is staying connected to the direction you've chosen. And when the expression of that direction changes, even when the expression of that direction changes, some weeks pressing forward looks strong and confident. Other weeks it looks quiet and minimal, and both of those count. This is also where comparison becomes especially dangerous. When you look around and see others moving faster, achieving more, or appearing more disciplined, it's easy to feel like you're doing something wrong. But comparison rarely accounts for context. It doesn't factor in capacity, history, or season. Pressing forward is personal. It's about honoring your pace while staying committed to the path that you're on. It's about resisting the pressure to prove something instead focusing on becoming someone who keeps showing up. And perhaps the most overlooked part of pressing forward in real life is learning how to trust yourself again. When you've quit in the past, it's easy to assume that you'll quit again. That assumption quietly undermines confidence before you even begin. But trust isn't rebuilt through promises. It's rebuilt through small, repeated acts of follow-through. Every time you keep going after a hard day, you restore a little bit of that trust. Every time you choose not to quit when it would be easier, you reinforce a new story about who you are becoming. That's not loud, it's not flashy, but man, is it powerful. Pressing forward anyway isn't about reinforcing or forcing yourself to be someone you're not. It's about allowing yourself to become someone who stays. And that kind of becoming happens slowly, steadily, and often unnoticed until one day you look back and realize you didn't quit this time. One of the things I wish I had understood sooner is that once you recognize a pattern, it doesn't magically disappear. You don't identify a trap once and then never fall into it again. You notice it, learn its shape, and then start recognizing it faster the next time it shows up. Growth doesn't remove the tension, it changes how quickly you see it for what it is. That's been true for every one of these traps in my life. The temptation to wait for the perfect time still shows up. It sounds more subtle now, more reasonable. It tells me I should pause until things feel more settled, until I have a little more clarity, until life feels a little less demanding. But I know that voice now. I know that waiting rarely brings relief. It usually just delays momentum. So instead of listening to it, I ask myself what it would look like to keep going gently instead of stopping entirely. The pull towards overplanning still appears too. There are days when I feel the urge to redesign everything, to start fresh, to fix what feels messy by creating something new and improved. Planning still feels productive, and it still gives me a sense of control. But now I can usually tell the difference between planning that supports action and planning that avoids it. If I find myself stuck in preparation without movement, that's a signal. Not to scrap everything, but to take one small step instead of designing a better system. The noise of too many voices hasn't gone away either. New ideas, new methods, and new opinions are everywhere, and they all promise clarity if you'll just listen a little longer. But I've learned that not every voice deserves my attention. Discernment has become more important than information. Instead of asking which approach is best, I ask which one fits me. Instead of trying to do everything well, I focus on doing something consistently. And then there's the temptation to restart, and that one is sneaky. Restarting feels hopeful. It feels clean. It offers the illusion of a fresh beginning without requiring the discomfort of continuing where you are. But most of the time, restarting is just another form of quitting dressed up as optimism. I've learned to pause when I feel that urge and ask myself what I'm really trying to escape. Am I restarting because something truly needs to change or because I'm uncomfortable staying in the middle? Often, the work isn't to start over, it's to stay. Staying when things feel ordinary, staying when progress feels slow, staying when there's no immediate payoff. That's where the transformation actually happens. These traps don't disappear as they grow. They lose their power because you recognize them sooner and respond differently. You don't shame yourself for noticing them. You simply choose not to follow them as far as you used to. That shift has changed the way I move through life. Instead of feeling defeated when old patterns resurface, I see it as an invitation to practice what I've learned, to apply wisdom instead of starting from scratch, and to respond with intention instead of reaction. That's what pressing forward looks like at this stage. It's quieter, it's steadier, and it's rooted in awareness rather than force. I don't need to eliminate every temptation to stop, pause, or restart. I just need to recognize when it shows up and decide how I want to respond. And most days, that response looks like continuing imperfectly, thoughtfully, and with more grace than I used to allow myself. Something subtle but important begins to change when you stop quitting. At first, it doesn't feel dramatic. There isn't a big movement where everything clicks or a sudden surge of confidence that tells you you've arrived somewhere new. Instead, the shift happens quietly, over time, as your actions begin to tell a different story than the one you've been telling yourself. For a long time, I carried an identity shaped by my unfinished attempts. Even when I didn't say it out loud, I believed certain things about myself, that I struggled with follow through, that consistency wasn't really my strength, that eventually I would lose momentum and fall back into old patterns. Those beliefs didn't come from nowhere, they were built from experience. But when you stop quitting, those stories begin to lose their grip. Every time you choose to keep going after a hard day, you interrupt the old narrative. Every time you adjust instead of abandoning the path, you reinforce something new. Slowly, you begin to see yourself differently, not as someone who gets everything right, but as someone who stays. That shift matters more than we often realize. Because when you don't trust yourself, everything feels heavier. Decisions feel riskier and commitments feel fragile. You hesitate to begin because you're already bracing for the disappointment. But when trust starts to rebuild, even in small ways, the whole process changes. You stop approaching growth like a test you might fail and start approaching it like a relationship you're nurturing. Trust doesn't come back all at once, it's rebuilt through small, repeated acts of follow through. Showing up again after a stumble, continuing when things feel unremarkable, and choosing not to dramatize every setback or inflate every misstep into something bigger than it needs to be. Those moments add up. And over time, you start to believe something different about yourself. You start to believe that you are capable of staying in the process and that you can handle discomfort without quitting, that you can be trusted to keep going even when things aren't perfect. That belief changes how you approach everything else. Goals feel less intimidating. Long-term commitments feel more realistic. You stop needing constant reassurance because you've seen the evidence over and over again that you don't disappear the moment things get hard. This identity shift isn't about becoming more disciplined or more productive. It's about becoming more grounded, more honest, more authentic, and more patient with yourself. It's about letting your identity be shaped by faithfulness instead of fear. When you stop quitting, you also stop needing to prove yourself. You're no longer performing consistency for validation. You're practicing it because it aligns with who you're becoming. That quiet confidence allows you to move forward without the same pressure to get it all right. And perhaps most importantly, you learn how to extend yourself grace without letting go of the direction. Grace doesn't mean lowering standards or abandoning goals. It means creating space for growth to happen realistically. It means allowing yourself to be human without using the humanity as an excuse to stop trying. This identity shift changes the way you relate to the future, too. Instead of wondering whether you'll stick with something, you assume that you will. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but steadily. That assumption creates momentum before you even begin. You don't need to feel confident to keep going. Confidence grows as a result of continuing, not as a prerequisite for it. When you look back after a while, the most surprising part isn't how far you've come, it's how different you feel about yourself along the way. The internal shift happens before the external results fully show up. And that internal shift is often the most lasting transformation of all. One of the hardest parts of any journey isn't the beginning or the ending, it's the middle. The middle is where the novelty wears off, where the initial resolve fades, and where the outcome still feels far away, but the work is very real and very present. It's the part no one really talks about because it doesn't feel inspiring or dramatic. It just feels ordinary. This is where most people quietly quit, not because they don't care anymore, but because the middle can feel discouraging in ways that are hard to name. Progress isn't happening, but it's subtle. Or it is happening, but it's subtle. Change is taking place, but it isn't obvious yet. And without visible markers of success, it's easy to wonder whether what you're doing even matters. I've learned that the middle is where the real work happens. It's where you discover whether your motivation was rooted in emotion or in conviction. It's where you begin to understand your own rhythms, limits, and patterns. And it's where you stop relying on excitement and start relying on commitment. The middle is also where the old voices tend to get louder. The voice that says, "This is taking too long." The voice that whispers, "You should be further along by now." And the voice that wonders, "Is this even worth it?" These voices don't usually show up all at once. They surface quietly in moments of fatigue or disappointment. And if you're not paying attention, they can slowly pull you back into old habits without you realizing what's happening. What's changed for me is that is not that those voices have disappeared. It's that I've learned how to recognize them for what they are. They're not indicators that something is wrong. They're signals that I'm in the middle. Instead of responding with panic or frustration, I've learned to pause and ask myself what I actually need in that moment. Do I need rest? Do I need to simplify? Do I need to adjust my expectations? Or do I simply need to keep going without demanding immediate results? Staying in the middle requires a different kind of strength than starting does. There's another reason the middle feels uncomfortable, and it's one that we don't always talk about. The middle strips away the illusion that growth is exciting. It forces you to sit with the reality that meaningful change is often quiet and repetitive, and it doesn't offer constant affirmation or visible milestones. Instead, it asks you to show up again, trusting that the work is doing something even when you can't point to immediate results. That can be unsettling, especially if you're someone who's used to measuring progress through clear wins and external feedback. In the middle, those markers are few and far between. You're often left alone with your own commitment without applause or reassurance. This is where self-trust is tested. Not the kind of trust that believes everything will be easy, but the kind that believes you can stay present even when it isn't. The kind that says, "I don't need to see the outcome today to keep going." The middle also reveals how quickly we look for escape when things feel uncomfortable. Sometimes that escape looks like distraction, and sometimes it looks like overworking. Other times it looks like quietly quitting and telling ourselves that we'll come back to it later. But growth rarely happens in the escape. It happens in the staying. Staying when the days feel similar, staying when this effort feels repetitive, staying when you're tempted to believe that nothing is changing simply because nothing is obvious yet. Over time, that kind of staying reshapes your expectations. You stop demanding instant transformation and start valuing steady presence. You learn that progress doesn't always feel like momentum, and sometimes it just feels like endurance. And endurance, while not glamorous, is deeply transformative. When you stay in the middle long enough, something shifts. The discomfort that once felt unbearable becomes familiar. The routines that once felt forced begin to feel natural, and the process starts to belong to you. You're no longer pushing yourself forward, you're walking with yourself through it. Starting is fueled by hope. The middle is sustained by trust. Trust that the small steps are adding up even when you can't see the picture fully yet. Trust that consistency is doing something beneath the surface even when it feels unremarkable. Trust that growth doesn't always announce itself. One of the biggest temptations in the middle is to romanticize about starting over. The idea of a fresh beginning can feel comforting when the middle feels heavy. Restarting promises relief, clarity, and a renewed sense of control, but most of the time, starting over doesn't actually solve the problem, it just resets the clock. Staying in the middle is what allows progress to compound. It's what allows lessons to deepen instead of repeat. It's what allows change to take root instead of constantly being replanted. That doesn't mean you never adjust. It means you adjust without abandoning yourself. There's a difference between course correcting and quitting, between refining and resetting, between listening to your limits and using discomfort as a reason to stop. Learning that difference has been one of the most freeing parts of this journey for me. The middle has also taught me more patience, not the passive kind, but the kind that stays engaged even when things move slowly. The kind that trusts timing without demanding immediate proof, and the kind that allows space for growth to unfold naturally. I used to think patience meant waiting, and now I understand it means continuing without rushing. Staying in the middle doesn't make you weaker, it makes you wiser. It teaches you how to live inside the process instead of constantly looking for an exit or an arrival. And over time, the middle stops feeling like a place where you're stuck and becomes a place where you're growing, quietly, steadily, and more deeply than you ever could have at the beginning. As I step back and look at all of this together, what stands out most isn't a single moment or decision. It's the way the journey changes when you stop measuring yourself by how often you restart and start paying attention to how often you stay. For a long time, I believed that starting over was evidence of hope, that every reset meant it was trying again, believing again, and willing myself toward change. And in some ways, that was true. But what I couldn't see then was how often restarting was actually interrupting growth instead of fueling it. Growth needs continuity. It needs time. It needs a space to be imperfect without being abandoned. Pressing forward anyway is what allows that space to exist. It's the decision to keep walking even when you're not sure how far you'll go. It's the choice to stay engaged when the process becomes ordinary, when the results aren't immediate, and when the excitement fades and all that's left is the quiet work of showing up. That quiet work is where most of life actually happens. There's something grounding about realizing that you don't have to outrun your past or erase it in order to move forward. You don't have to pretend that you haven't stumbled before or rewrite your story as if those chapters never existed. You can carry them honestly, learn from them, and still choose not to live in them anymore. The past doesn't have to be a weight, it can be a teacher. And when you allow it to shape wisdom instead of shame, you free yourself to move differently in the present. One of the most freeing things I've learned is that pressing forward doesn't require certainty. It doesn't demand that you feel confident every day or motivated every step of the way. It asks for a willingness, the willingness to continue even when things feel unclear. That willingness shows up in small, unremarkable ways. It shows up when you choose not to quit after a hard week, when you adjust instead of abandon, and when you keep going without making a big announcement or demanding visible progress. Those choices don't draw attention, but they build something far more durable than motivation ever could. They build trust. Trust in yourself, trust in the process, trust that growth can happen quietly and still be meaningful. When you stop quitting, you also stop negotiating with yourself every time things get hard. You no longer need to convince yourself to begin again because you never fully disengaged in the first place. You stayed connected, even loosely, to the direction that you've chosen. And that connection changes everything. It allows progress to accumulate instead of constantly resetting. It allows lessons to layer instead of being relearned from scratch. It allows you to see yourself as someone who continues rather than someone who cycles. And that shift reshapes how you approach the future. Instead of asking whether you'll follow through this time, you assume that you will, imperfectly, realistically, and with a lot of grace. That assumption quiets the internal debate and frees up the energy that used to be spent doubting yourself. As you listen to this, you might be thinking about something that you've started and stopped more times than you can count, something you care about deeply but haven't known how to sustain. Friend, I do too. Something that you've quietly labeled as a personal weakness or a character flaw. And if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not incapable of change. You have just been stuck in a pattern that taught you to quit instead of continue, and patterns can be unlearned. Pressing forward anyway doesn't require you to overhaul your life or prove anything to anyone. It simply invites you to stay connected to what matters, even when the path feels longer than you expected. It asks you to take the next step without demanding that you see the whole road in front of you. And that's enough. Not flashy enough to impress, not dramatic enough to post about it, but steady enough to change you over time. When you look back later, what will matter most won't be how quickly you moved or how cleanly you executed the plan. It will be that you stayed, that you kept walking, that you didn't give up on yourself when it would have been easier to do so. Pressing forward anyway is not about proving strength. It's about practicing faithfulness to your values, to your growth, and to the person that you're becoming. And that practice, repeated over time, has a way of carrying you farther than you ever expected. Before we close today, I want to thank you for being here, truly. This space exists because people choose to show up, listen honestly, and carry these conversations beyond this moment. If this episode resonated with you, I want to invite you to share it with someone who might need it too. A friend who feels stuck, someone who keeps starting over, someone who could use the reminder that progress doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Sometimes the most meaningful growth happens quietly, one shared conversation at a time. And before I go, I want you to know something. I'm slowly working on a few simple companion tools to support this space. Nothing rushed, nothing big, just gentle things that help us practice what we're talking about here in real life, one step at a time. If there's something in this episode that met you where you are, you're always welcome to reach out. You don't have to comment publicly or have perfect words. Even a short message is enough. I read every single one, and hearing what's landing helps to shape where this space grows next. I also want you to know that this podcast is still growing slowly, intentionally, and with a lot of care. My heart is continuing to create spaces like this, and in time to offer more ways to walk alongside you through healing, growth, and faith practiced out loud. Nothing forced, nothing hurried, just room to grow together as this community takes shape. If you're new here, I'd love for you to explore some of our earlier episodes. They're all part of the same ongoing conversation. And if you've been here for a while, thank you for continuing to come back and help build this space with me. New long-form episodes release every Monday, and shorter devotional episodes come out on Thursdays, each one designed to meet you where you are and remind you that you're not walking this journey alone. Wherever you find yourself today, I hope you leave this episode feeling steadied rather than stirred up, encouraged rather than overwhelmed, and reminded that continuing, even imperfectly, matters far more than starting over again.